You're just the backup groom." The words didn't echo. They cut clean, precise, like a truth that had been waiting all night to be said out loud. Adrian Wolfe didn't move. Not when the sentence landed. Not when the woman in the white dress adjusted her veil and turned away from him, as if he were nothing more than a placeholder in a carefully staged performance. Around him, the wedding carried on in perfect rhythm. Crystal glasses chimed softly. A string quartet played something elegant and forgettable. Laughter floated through the air, light and careless, like no one had just watched a man's reality quietly collapse in front of them. The ballroom stretched wide under golden chandeliers, every surface polished, every detail curated to reflect wealth, power, control. The kind of room Adrian had owned 100 times over. The kind of room where he never lost. Until tonight. He sat at the edge of a long table dressed in white linen, a single untouched glass of bourbon resting near his hand. 3 inches of amber liquid. $1,200 a bottle. He didn't taste it. Didn't need to. Across the room, guests leaned in toward one another, voices lowered but not low enough. He didn't know? No one told him. That's brutal. Adrian heard every word without looking up. Years in boardrooms had trained him to read silence better than speech. And right now, silence was louder than anything else. His jaw tightened slightly, the only crack in an otherwise controlled exterior. Adrian Wolfe didn't react. He calculated. He assessed. He adapted. That was how he built an empire worth billions before turning 40. But this wasn't a negotiation. There was no contract to rewrite, no leverage to pull. Just a stage, a script, and the realization that he had never been the lead. A shadow moved at the edge of his table. Quiet. Unrushed. A presence that didn't belong to the chaos of the room. A waitress. Black uniform, pressed clean. Steps measured, almost deliberate. She set a fresh glass beside him, though his first hadn't been touched. Her hand was steady. Her posture, composed. But it was her eyes that made him look up. Not soft. Not submissive. Observing. Reading. "You don't belong in that chair tonight," she said softly, just enough for him to hear, her voice calm but certain. Adrian blinked once, caught off guard not by the words, but by the absence of hesitation behind them. No apology. No fear. Just truth. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to place something that didn't fit the pattern. People usually spoke to him with angles, with something to gain. This felt different. "Then where do I belong?" he asked quietly, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual edge. The waitress held his gaze for half a second longer than most would dare. Then she leaned in slightly, just enough for the words to feel like they were meant only for him. "Somewhere you're not being used." The music swelled. Applause broke out near the stage. The bride had stepped into the spotlight, radiant, controlled, already rewriting the narrative for everyone watching. Adrian glanced toward her, then back at the woman standing beside him. For the first time that night, something shifted, not in the room, but in him. A pause. A question. And just before she stepped away, she said it. Quiet. Measured. Unshakable. "Trust me, just play along." Adrian did not answer right away, not because he did not understand her, but because something in the way she said it unsettled him more than the humiliation still echoing across the room. "Trust me" was not a phrase people used on him, not without an agenda, not without fear, and yet her tone carried neither, only certainty, the kind that did not ask for permission. Across the ballroom, the bride lifted her glass, the microphone catching the soft intake of her breath as the room slowly quieted. Guests turning, cameras rising, attention shifting exactly where she wanted it. And Adrian knew that moment was not accidental. It was orchestrated, every second of it, including his silence. He exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the glass before finally standing, the chair sliding back with a subtle sound that still managed to draw a few glances. Curiosity flickering across faces that had already begun rewriting the story in their heads. The waitress was already moving, not rushing, not looking back, simply walking toward the center aisle as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to cross a room filled with people who would normally never see her. Adrian hesitated for half a second, a lifetime for a man used to instant decisions, then followed. Whispers rose immediately, sharper now, more focused, because something unexpected was happening, and unexpected meant valuable, something worth watching. "What is he doing?" Someone murmured, not quietly enough, The bride's smile tightened just slightly as her eyes tracked his movement. A flicker of calculation replacing the polished warmth she had practiced in the mirror. Adrian felt it. The shift, the subtle change in the room's temperature, the way attention bent toward him again. But this time it felt different, not controlled, not contained. The waitress stopped just short of the stage, turning just enough so he could hear her, without anyone else catching the words. "When I step forward, you do not speak," she said, her voice calm, measured, like she had rehearsed this moment long before tonight. "Let them listen first." Adrian studied her profile, the precision in her posture, the absence of doubt, and something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not trust, not yet, but something close enough to follow. She stepped up onto the low platform, heels barely making a sound against polished wood, and for a split second the room did not know how to react. Because she did not fit the script, she was not part of the program. And that alone made people pay attention. The bride paused, microphone still in hand, her expression caught between confusion and irritation. A moment too long for someone so practiced. "Excuse me," the waitress said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows without needing the microphone. Controlled but undeniable. "Before this continues, there is something everyone here deserves to understand." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but real, like wind across still water. Adrian stood just behind her, close enough to feel the steadiness in her presence, far enough to remain silent as instructed, his usual instinct to take control held back by something he could not yet name. The bride let out a soft laugh, polished, dismissive, stepping slightly forward as if to reclaim the moment. "I am not sure who you think you are," she began, her tone sweet but edged, the kind that had closed deals and ended conversations. But the waitress did not move, did not react, did not yield. Instead, she reached into the small pocket of her apron, fingers precise, and pulled out a single folded card, simple, unremarkable, the kind no one would notice unless they were meant to. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not at the object, but at the shift it represented, because whatever came next was not improvisation, it was intention. And for the first time that night, the man who had built his life on control realized he was no longer the only one in the room who understood how power actually worked. The room did not breathe, not really, not after she unfolded the card with a calm that did not match the tension tightening every face in the front row. It was not dramatic, not loud, just a small, deliberate motion, but it pulled attention harder than any speech could have, because people sense precision, and precision meant intent. Adrian watched the card between her fingers, a simple matte surface. No logo visible from where he stood, yet something about the way she held it suggested weight. Far beyond paper. The bride took a step closer, her smile still present but thinner now, stretched just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her voice polished but no longer warm. Each word placed carefully, as if she could still steer the moment back into something she controlled. The waitress did not respond immediately, and that silence worked in her favor, expanding, pressing against the edges of the room until even the soft hum of the air system seemed too loud. Then she spoke, steady, unhurried, her tone neither confrontational nor submissive, simply certain. "You are right," she said, glancing briefly toward the bride before returning her gaze to the crowd. This moment was not supposed to happen like this. A ripple of confusion passed through the guests, subtle shifts of posture, heads tilting, phones lifting just a little higher. Adrian felt it too, that shift from spectacle to something sharper, something real. The waitress lifted the card slightly, just enough for the front rows to see the edge of a printed seal. "This," she continued, "is a document that was never meant to be read tonight." The bride's composure flickered again, quicker this time, almost imperceptible, but Adrian caught it, the same way he caught hesitation in negotiations worth hundreds of millions. It was not fear yet, but it was close. "I suggest you put that away," the bride said, her voice lowering, the sweetness gone now, replaced by something firmer, something closer to command. The waitress turned her head just enough to meet her eyes, and in that brief exchange something passed between them, recognition, history, something unresolved. "You already had your moment," the waitress replied quietly, Now it is his. She did not need to point, did not need to look back. Everyone knew who she meant. Adrian felt the weight of every gaze shift again, landing on him. But this time it did not feel like judgment. It felt like expectation. The waitress stepped half a pace to the side, not leaving the stage, but creating space, positioning him without forcing him, guiding without touching. "You said trust you," Adrian murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, his voice steady but edged with something new, something searching. "Then trust me back," she answered without hesitation, her eyes finally meeting his fully, unflinching, unwavering. For a fraction of a second, the room disappeared for him. The whispers, the lights, the carefully curated perfection of the evening, all of it faded behind the clarity of that moment. He nodded once, not dramatically, not for the room, but for her. The waitress turned back to the audience, lifting the card slightly higher now, her voice carrying just enough to hold them all in place. "There are stories we tell in public," she said, "and there are truths we hide in private." The words settled over the room like a slow realization, not explosive, not chaotic, but undeniable. The bride shifted her weight, a small step backward that only those watching closely would notice. Adrian stepped forward into the space she had created, not reclaiming control the way he always had, but stepping into something different, something he had not felt in years, if ever. Beside him, the waitress remained still, not overshadowing him, not disappearing either, just present, like a constant he had not known he needed. And as the silence deepened again, heavier now, more focused, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever came next would not follow the script they had been given. And for the first time that night, Adrian was not the one being positioned, he was the one being revealed. Adrian did not rush his next move, not because he lacked words, but because for the first time in a long time, he understood that timing mattered more than dominance, and the room felt that shift before he even spoke. The lights above seemed warmer now, or maybe it was the way attention had narrowed, focused entirely on the space between him and the woman beside him, the one who had stepped into a moment no one had offered her and made it her own. He reached slowly toward the card in her hand, not taking it immediately, but acknowledging it, acknowledging her, and that gesture alone changed something, subtle but undeniable, because people noticed when a man like Adrian Wolf chose to follow instead of lead. The bride inhaled sharply, a sound almost lost beneath the quiet murmur building again, her control slipping not in words but in rhythm, her perfectly timed evening now off-beat by seconds she could not recover. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice steadier than before but lacking the authority it once carried, like a script being read after the audience had already seen behind the curtain. Adrian finally took the card, feeling its weight, heavier than it should have been, not because of the paper, but because of what it represented, the unseen, the unspoken, the version of tonight that had not been meant for him. He glanced down briefly, just enough to register the seal, the signatures, the familiar structure of something designed to protect interests, not people. Then he looked back up, not at the bride, not at the crowd, but at the waitress. "You knew," he said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating a realization. She nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, but it carried certainty. "I listened," she replied, her voice even, as if that alone explained everything. And in a way, it did. Adrian exhaled, a slow release of something he had been holding all night, maybe longer, and then he turned, finally facing the room fully, the way he had done countless times before, but this time without the armor, without the performance. "I have spent my entire career reading agreements," he began, his voice carrying naturally, not raised, not forced, just present, and the room leaned in, instinctively, because they recognized authority even when it was quiet. Terms, conditions, expectations, all the ways people define value without ever mentioning truth. A few guests shifted in their seats, the tone different now, less spectacle, more substance. The bride stood still, her expression composed again, but her eyes sharper, watching, calculating, waiting for a misstep. Adrian held the card up slightly, not displaying it fully, just enough to confirm its existence. "Tonight," he continued, "I was part of an agreement I did not fully read. A soft ripple moved through the crowd. Not laughter, not shock, something closer to recognition. And that is on me. The admission landed differently than anything else that had been said, because it was not defensive, not reactive. It was ownership, and ownership changed the narrative. Beside him, the waitress remained still, her presence steady, not drawing attention, not avoiding it, simply anchoring the moment. Adrian lowered the card slightly, his gaze shifting now, finally, to the bride. But what I did not agree to, he said, his tone tightening just enough to draw a line, was being misrepresented in front of everyone here. The room stilled again, sharper this time, the air thinner, more deliberate. The bride's smile returned, but it did not reach her eyes. Adrian, she said, softer now, almost persuasive, you are misunderstanding the situation. He did not interrupt her, did not react, just listened, the same way the woman beside him had. And in that silence, in that restraint, something irreversible took shape, because the man who once controlled every outcome was no longer trying to control this one. He was choosing to reveal it, piece by piece, with someone who had seen the truth before he did and refused to let him disappear inside it. The bride did not step back this time. She stepped forward, closing the space between her and Adrian with practiced grace, the kind that had convinced rooms full of investors, the kind that had built alliances on appearances alone. There is no misrepresentation, she said, her voice softer now, almost intimate, as if the rest of the room had disappeared, and this was simply a conversation between two people who already knew how things worked. But the room had not disappeared, it had sharpened. Every guest now fully present, every glance fixed on the unfolding shift that no longer felt like a ceremony, but something closer to a reckoning. Adrian watched her carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that made her words feel smaller than they were meant to be. Then explain it, he replied, his tone even, giving her the space she thought she wanted. Knowing that space often revealed more than pressure ever could, she smiled again, that same controlled expression, and turned slightly toward the audience, reclaiming her stage with a pivot that would have worked minutes ago. This is a strategic union, she said, lifting her chin just enough. Two families aligning interests, resources, futures. That is what everyone here understands. A few heads nodded automatically, conditioned agreement, the language of power they all spoke fluently. And Adrian, she added, glancing back at him, has always understood that. The implication hung there, subtle but pointed, an attempt to pull him back into the role he had been assigned, the role that required silence disguised as consent. Adrian let the silence stretch, not resisting it, letting it do its work, letting the weight of her words settle across the room before responding. I understand strategy, he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying further now. I built my life on it. He took a small step forward, closing the gap she had tried to control, but not in confrontation, in alignment, in presence. What I did not understand, he continued, lifting the card slightly again, was that I was the only one not given the full terms. That shifted the room, not dramatically, but enough, a recalibration of perspective, a crack in the polished narrative. The bride's eyes flickered, just once, calculating again, adjusting. You had every opportunity to review everything. She countered quickly, her tone tightening beneath the surface. Adrian nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in that, but not surrendering to it. Opportunity is not the same as transparency, he said, the distinction landing with quiet precision. Beside him, the waitress remained still, but her presence felt larger now, not because she moved, but because the truth she had introduced was unfolding exactly as she had intended. Adrian turned his head slightly toward her, not enough for the room to notice, but enough to signal recognition, something unspoken passing between them. Then he faced forward again. You built this evening to look perfect, he said, his gaze returning to the bride. Every detail planned, every moment controlled. His voice did not rise, but it held something stronger now, something rooted. But perfection only works when no one asks questions. A low murmur moved through the guests again, more present this time, less cautious. The bride's composure held, but the edges were visible now, the strain beneath the surface no longer completely hidden. And what exactly are you suggesting? She asked, her tone sharpened just enough to reveal the challenge beneath it. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he lowered the card and looked out across the room, taking in the faces, the expectations, the silent judgments that had defined his world for so long. "I am suggesting," he said finally, turning back toward her, "that tonight was never about partnership." The words settled heavier than anything before, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. The room stilled again, deeper this time, because now it was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what it meant, and standing beside him, the woman who had started it all did not interrupt, did not step forward, because she did not need to. She had already done what no one else had dared to do. She had given him the one thing he had been missing all along, not power, not leverage, but the truth at the exact moment he needed it most. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt charged, like the air just before a storm that everyone could sense but no one could predict. And for the first time that night, the balance in the room had shifted away from spectacle and into something far more dangerous, something real. The bride held her ground, her posture still composed, but the rhythm of her control was gone now, replaced by calculation that came a fraction too late. "If this is not about partnership," she said, her voice carefully measured, "then what exactly do you think it is about?" Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he understood the weight of naming something out loud, the way truth, once spoken, could not be undone or negotiated. He glanced down at the card again, then back at her, and then beyond her, to the room that had been built to witness a celebration but was now witnessing something else entirely. "It is about positioning," he said finally, his tone steady, each word placed with intention. "About access, about credibility, about attaching your name to mine long enough to secure everything you needed." A low murmur rippled outward, sharper now, more reactive, because people understood that language, they lived in it, they built fortunes on it. The bride's expression did not collapse, but it shifted, the softness gone now, replaced by something firmer, something closer to defense. "That is how alliances work," she replied, lifting her chin slightly, reclaiming a piece of her confidence. "No one here is naive about that." Adrian nodded once, acknowledging the truth within the statement, but not conceding the point. "Alliances require agreement," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room with clarity, not assumption. The distinction landed, subtle but precise, drawing a line that could not be blurred. Beside him, the waitress remained still, but her eyes moved across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but observing, measuring reactions the way someone trained to read people does. Adrian turned slightly toward her again, just enough to register her presence, grounding himself in the unexpected steadiness she had brought into a moment that had been designed to isolate him. Then he stepped forward again, closing the distance between himself and the bride, not aggressively, but deliberately, reclaiming space without raising his voice. "You planned this," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. "Every detail, every announcement, every moment leading to this stage." She held his gaze, unflinching now, choosing not to deny it. "Of course I did," she said, her tone sharpening with a hint of pride. "That is what successful people do, Adrian. They plan outcomes." A few guests shifted again, some leaning in, others pulling back, the room dividing in quiet, invisible lines. Adrian let a small breath leave him, not frustration, not defeat, something closer to release. "Then you should have planned for this," he said, lifting the card slightly higher, enough now for more of the front rows to see the official seal pressed into its surface. That was the moment the room changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because seals meant legitimacy, and legitimacy meant risk. The bride's eyes flickered, faster this time, the calculation behind them no longer hidden. "What is that?" someone whispered from the crowd, not meant to be heard, but heard anyway. Adrian did not answer them, his attention still fixed on the woman in front of him. "You built a perfect moment," he continued, his voice steady. "But you forgot one thing." He paused, not for effect, but because the truth deserved space. Perfect moments only hold when everyone involved is fully informed. The words settled heavily, not as an accusation, but as a fact. The bride's composure tightened again, her shoulders squared, her smile returning but thinner, controlled. "And now what?" she asked, her tone low, measured, but edged with something sharper beneath it. Adrian did not rush his answer. Instead, he glanced once more at the waitress beside him, the one who had seen what he had not, who had stepped forward when everyone else stayed still, and in that brief look, something unspoken passed again, not instruction, not command, but alignment. Then he faced forward, his voice calm, grounded in something deeper than power. "Now," he said, "we stop pretending this was ever equal." And as the words settled into the room, heavier than anything before, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about a disrupted wedding. It was about the unraveling of a narrative that had been carefully built, and the emergence of a truth that had been waiting, quietly, for someone brave enough to speak it. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a held breath shared by dozens of people who suddenly realized they were no longer watching a celebration, but standing inside a turning point. And Adrian could feel it in the way no one reached for their glasses. No one checked their phones. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. The bride's composure held, but it was no longer effortless. It was maintained, constructed in real time, her mind working behind her eyes as she recalculated every possible outcome. "Equal," she repeated softly, as if testing the word for weakness, then let out a controlled breath, her voice regaining some of its earlier poise. "Adrian, you are making this far more dramatic than it needs to be." A few guests shifted, some nodding faintly, clinging to familiarity, to the version of events that felt safer, simpler. Adrian did not react to them. He did not need to, because he understood something now that he had not before. That truth did not need volume. It needed clarity. "No," he said calmly, his tone steady. "I am making it visible." The distinction landed sharper than anything loud could have, and for a moment, no one spoke. Beside him, the waitress finally moved, not forward, not into the spotlight, but just enough to step closer to the edge of it, her presence aligning with his without overshadowing him. Her eyes swept briefly across the front rows, not searching, not seeking approval, but acknowledging that they were all witnesses now. Adrian lowered the card slightly, not hiding it, but no longer presenting it as the center, because the focus had shifted from evidence to understanding. "You counted on silence," he continued, his gaze returning to the bride. "On the idea that I would recognize the benefit and ignore the terms." She held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, just a pause, a calculation that had run out of immediate answers. "That is how this world works," she said finally, her voice quieter now, more direct, stripped of its earlier performance. Adrian nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "It is how it has worked," he corrected gently, the shift intense, subtle, but deliberate. A murmur passed through the room again, different this time, less reactive, more reflective, as if people were no longer watching a conflict, but recognizing a pattern. The bride's posture straightened, her shoulders firm, choosing not to retreat, choosing instead to stand inside the moment she had created. "And what are you going to do?" she asked, her tone steady. But the question carried weight now, because it was no longer rhetorical, it was real. Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the importance of choosing the next step without reacting to the pressure of the room. His eyes moved briefly, just once, toward the woman beside him, the one who had shifted everything without raising her voice, and in that glance there was something new, something earned, not authority, not dependency, but trust. She did not speak, did not nod, did not guide him further, because she did not need to. She had already done what mattered. Adrian stepped forward, just a few inches, but enough to change his position from participant to decision-maker. "I am going to correct it," he said finally, his voice calm, grounded, each word carrying intention rather than force. The bride's expression tightened, slightly, the smallest fracture in her control. "By walking away," he added, not dramatically, not as a threat, but as a choice. The words settled deeper than anything before, because walking away was not weakness in a room built on power. It was the one move no one could control. A quiet ripple moved through the guests, not shock, not disbelief, something closer to respect mixed with uncertainty. Adrian turned his head slightly, not toward the crowd, but toward the waitress, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "You knew this would be the only way," he said. She met his gaze, her expression steady, almost calm in a way that did not seek recognition. "I knew it was the only honest one," she replied softly. And in that moment, as the room stood suspended between expectation and reality, it became clear that the power in the space had shifted completely, not to the man who once controlled everything, but to the truth that neither of them was willing to ignore anymore. For a moment, nothing moved, not the bride, not the guests, not even the musicians who stood frozen with instruments in hand, as if unsure whether the night they were hired to perform still existed. Adrian's words did not echo. They settled, heavy and irreversible, and the meaning behind them spread slowly across the room like a realization no one could avoid. The bride's lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in recalculation, her mind shifting faster now, searching for leverage where none remained. "You cannot be serious," she said finally, her voice lower, tighter, stripped of ceremony. "Do you understand what you are walking away from?" Adrian looked at her, not dismissively, not angrily, but with a calm that made the question feel smaller than it was meant to be. "Yes," he said simply, and that simplicity carried more weight than any explanation could have. A quiet murmur rose again, not chaotic, but alive, because people understood loss in numbers, in deals, in percentages. But what they were witnessing now was something different, a choice that could not be calculated. The bride took a step closer, closing the gap again, her voice dropping further, almost private though everyone could hear it. "This is not just about us," she said, her tone firm, pressing. "There are families involved, investors, reputations. This does not end cleanly." Adrian nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that, because he knew better than anyone how wide the consequences could spread. "It was never clean," he replied quietly. "It was just well presented." That landed, deeper than before, because it reframed everything, not as a disruption, but as a revelation. Beside him, the waitress remained composed, her posture steady, her presence now undeniable to everyone watching, not as an interruption, but as a turning point. Adrian shifted his gaze briefly toward her, and for the first time, there was something like gratitude in it, not spoken, not displayed, but real. She met his eyes with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, not asking for acknowledgement, not expecting anything in return. The bride exhaled slowly, her composure tightening once more, gathering what remained of her control. "Then say it clearly," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Say what you are choosing in front of everyone." The room leaned in again, drawn by the clarity of the challenge. Because this was the moment where ambiguity would disappear, Adrian did not hesitate this time. Because the decision had already been made the moment he chose to stand beside the truth instead of behind the performance. He turned fully toward the room, his voice steady, grounded, carrying without force. "I am choosing not to proceed," he said, each word deliberate, unmistakable. The silence that followed was different, not tense, not uncertain, but final. A few guests shifted in their seats. Others exchanged glances, but no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to negotiate. The bride held his gaze for a long second, her expression unreadable now, not defeated, not broken, but changed, as if she was already rewriting the outcome in her own mind. "Then this is your decision," she said, her voice composed again, though quieter, more contained. Adrian nodded once, not as confirmation for her, but as acknowledgement of himself. He lowered the card slightly, no longer needing it as proof, because the truth had already been spoken. Then, without urgency, without hesitation, he stepped back from the stage, not retreating, but leaving on his own terms. The movement was simple, but it carried a gravity that shifted the entire room. The waitress turned with him, not leading this time, not guiding, just walking beside him as if that had always been the plan. And as they moved through the aisle, past rows of silent guests, past tables set for a celebration that no longer existed, it became clear that what had begun as a carefully orchestrated moment had transformed into something no one could have predicted. Not a loss, Not a scandal, but a quiet, undeniable act of choosing truth over appearance. And in that choice, something far more powerful than any agreement had been revealed. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened before anyone could announce it. A quiet mechanical motion that felt louder than the applause that had never come, and Adrian did not slow his pace as he walked toward them, not because he was in a hurry, but because for the first time that night, he knew exactly where he was going. The sound of his shoes against polished marble echoed softly, measured, steady, each step creating distance between him and a version of himself that had been built on expectation rather than choice. Beside him, the waitress moved with the same calm rhythm, her presence no longer unnoticed, no longer invisible, but not seeking attention either, simply aligned with the moment as it unfolded. Behind them, the room began to breathe again, whispers rising, questions forming, but none of it reached them in the same way, because something fundamental had shifted, not in the space, but in perspective. As they crossed into the lobby, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, the distant hum of the city replacing the orchestrated elegance they had just left behind. Adrian paused just inside the entrance, not turning back, not hesitating, just allowing the moment to settle fully, the weight of what had just happened grounding itself into something real. He glanced toward the glass doors that revealed the night beyond, the reflection of the city lights stretching across the pavement, open, unstructured, unscripted. "You did not have to do that," he said. Finally, his voice lower now, no longer carrying for a room, but meant for one person. The waitress stopped beside him, her posture still composed, but softer now without the weight of 100 eyes measuring her presence. "Yes, I did," she replied simply, her tone unchanged, as if the answer had never been in question. Adrian studied her for a moment, really looking this time, not as someone passing through his world, but as someone who had stepped into it and altered its direction. "You risked your job," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation grounded in reality. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, her gaze shifting briefly toward the ballroom doors behind them before returning forward. "Some things cost more if you stay quiet," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that came from experience rather than theory. Adrian absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the truth embedded in a sentence that did not need explanation. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the glass, casting brief reflections that moved across both of them, before disappearing again. "You knew about the agreement," he said, more a statement than a question now. She nodded once, not elaborating, not expanding beyond what was necessary. "I have seen versions of it before," she replied, her words careful, measured, as if each one was chosen with intention. Adrian leaned slightly against the marble column beside him, not out of fatigue, but out of a need to pause, to understand the person who had just rewritten the course of his night. "And you decided to intervene," he said. She met his gaze again, steady, unwavering. "I decided not to ignore it," she corrected gently. That distinction settled between them, quiet but significant, the difference between action and integrity. Adrian let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, but reflective, as if something long held had finally shifted into place. "People usually do," he said, almost to himself. The waitress did not respond immediately, giving the silence space to exist without filling it unnecessarily. Then she spoke, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "That is why it keeps happening." The words lingered, not as criticism, not as judgment, but as a simple observation of a pattern. Too many had accepted. Adrian straightened slightly, his posture returning, but not to the rigid control it once held, something in it now more grounded, more deliberate. He looked back toward the ballroom doors once, not with regret, but with clarity, then turned away fully. "What is your name?" he asked, not out of formality, but because it mattered now. She held his gaze for a brief second before answering. "Naomi," she said. Adrian nodded slowly, committing it, not just the name, but everything it now represented. "Naomi," he repeated quietly, and for the first time that night, there was no performance behind his voice, no calculated tone, just presence. Outside, the city waited, wide and unstructured, and as they stood there, no longer part of the script that had been written for them. It became clear that what came next would not be defined by contracts or expectations, but by something far less predictable and far more real, a choice that had already begun the moment one person refused to stay silent, and another chose to listen. The city outside did not pause for what had just happened inside. It never did. Cars moved, lights shifted, distant sirens blended into the rhythm of a night that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. And Adrian stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was unsure, but because he was adjusting to something unfamiliar, a space where no one expected anything from him except honesty. Naomi remained beside him, not stepping ahead, not stepping back, simply present. Her attention not fixed on him alone but aware of everything around them. As if she had learned long ago how quickly a moment could change, the glass doors behind them opened briefly as a couple exited the ballroom. Their voices low but urgent, fragments of conversation slipping into the lobby before fading again, words like contracts, headlines, consequences, all the things that would follow what had just been set in motion. Adrian heard them, but they did not land the same way they would have an hour ago, because for once, the outcome was not something he needed to control. He shifted his gaze back to Naomi, studying her again, not with curiosity alone, but with a growing understanding that her presence here had not been accidental. "You said you have seen versions of that agreement before," he said, his voice calm, grounded, as if continuing a conversation that had been waiting longer than tonight. Naomi nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful but steady. "Different names, different settings, same structure," she replied, her tone measured. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just factual. Adrian straightened a little his mind, moving through possibilities, patterns, the kind he had built his career recognizing. "And you recognized it tonight," he said. She gave a small nod again, but this time there was something more behind it, something personal. "I recognized the signs," she said, her eyes briefly flicking toward the ballroom doors before returning to him. Adrian let that settle, the implication of experience, of awareness shaped by more than observation. "That is not something most people catch," he said. Naomi's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "Most people are not looking," she answered simply. The statement lingered, quiet but pointed, and Adrian found himself considering it more deeply than he expected. He glanced toward the entrance again, the reflection of the city lights shifting across the polished floor, then back to her. "What were you looking for?" he asked. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, not avoiding the question, but choosing her words carefully. "The moment when someone decides whether to stay silent or not," she said. Adrian absorbed that, the precision of it, the way it reframed everything that had happened inside. He let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, but reflective. "And you decided for me," he said quietly. Naomi shook her head slightly, her gaze steady. "No," she replied. "I gave you a chance to decide for yourself." That distinction landed differently, deeper, because it returned the choice to him, where it belonged. Adrian nodded once, understanding now not just what she had done, but how she had done it. Another set of footsteps approached from behind them, slower this time, more deliberate, and Adrian did not need to turn to know who it might be. The energy of it carried a familiarity, a weight of unfinished conversation. Naomi noticed it too, her posture shifting just slightly, not defensive, not tense, but aware. Adrian remained still, not retreating, not preparing to engage, simply grounded in the space he had chosen. The doors behind them opened again, and the sound of the ballroom returned for a brief second, softer now, more distant, like something already becoming memory. Adrian turned his head just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him, but he did not step back. He did not move aside, because whatever came next, it would not be dictated by the script that had been written for him. It would be shaped by the same clarity that had brought him here, standing beside someone who had nothing to gain, nothing to prove, and everything to lose, and still chose to speak when it mattered most. The footsteps behind them did not rush. They approached with the same measured confidence that had defined the entire evening, and Adrian turned just enough to meet it, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge what had followed him out of the ballroom. The bride stood a few feet away now, no longer framed by chandeliers or cameras, no longer elevated by the stage she had carefully controlled, and without it, something about her presence felt different, still composed, still powerful, but no longer untouchable. "You always preferred clean exits," she said quietly, her voice no longer performing for a crowd, but carrying a sharper edge now that the audience had changed. Adrian held her gaze, calm, steady, no longer reacting to the tone behind her words. "I prefer honest ones," he replied, his voice even, not defensive, not dismissive, just certain. The space between them held a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but revealing, the kind that allowed truths to exist without interruption. Naomi remained where she was, slightly to Adrian's side, not stepping forward, not retreating, her presence balanced between awareness and restraint, as if she understood that this moment was not hers to lead, but hers to witness. The bride exhaled slowly, her composure tightening again, but this time it felt deliberate, chosen rather than automatic. "You think this ends here," she said, her tone controlled. "But decisions like this do not disappear. They follow you. They reshape everything around you." Adrian nodded slightly, not rejecting the statement, because he knew it was true. Consequences were never simple, never contained. "I know," he said quietly, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to minimize what came next. That answer shifted something, subtle but real, because it removed the leverage her warning was meant to create. The bride studied him for a moment longer, her eyes searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that could be turned back into control, but she found none. Instead, she glanced briefly toward Naomi, her gaze sharper now, more direct. "And you," she said, her voice cool, measured. "You stepped into something that was not yours." Naomi met her gaze without flinching, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. "Silence makes it everyone's," she replied calmly, her words not loud, not confrontational, but grounded in a truth that did not need volume. The statement settled between them, not escalating the tension, but clarifying it. The bride held her gaze for a second longer, then looked away, not defeated, not yielding, but recalibrating, already moving forward in her own way. "This was never personal," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. Adrian considered that for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That is exactly the problem," he replied, his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind it deeper than before. The bride's lips pressed together briefly, the smallest sign of acknowledgement before she turned, her movements precise, controlled, already stepping back into a world where narratives could be rebuilt and outcomes reshaped. The glass doors behind her opened again, the sound of the ballroom returning for a moment before fading as she disappeared inside. The lobby fell quiet once more, the weight of what had just passed settling into something final. Adrian remained where he was, not watching her go, not looking back, his attention returning instead to the present, to the space he had chosen. He glanced toward Naomi, not as someone who had intervened, but as someone who had stood beside him when it mattered. "You did not just change tonight," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful, grounded. "You changed the direction of something much larger." Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head slightly, her expression calm, almost reflective. "No," she replied softly. "You did that when you chose not to ignore it." The distinction lingered, quiet but significant, and Adrian let out a slow breath, the kind that came with understanding rather than relief. Outside, the city continued, unchanged, but for him, something fundamental had shifted, not in what he owned, not in what he controlled, but in what he recognized as worth holding on to, and standing there beside someone who had nothing to gain from the moment and everything to lose. He understood that power, real power, had never been about control at all. It had always been about the courage to see clearly and act when it mattered most. The lobby grew quieter with each passing second, not because the world outside had slowed, but because the weight of what had just unfolded was settling into something more permanent, something that could not be undone by a revised statement or a carefully crafted explanation. Adrian stood still for a moment longer, his gaze drifting toward the glass doors again, watching the reflection of passing headlights stretch and disappear across the polished floor, each one brief, each one moving forward without hesitation. Naomi remained beside him, her posture relaxed now, no longer carrying the invisible tension of the ballroom, but still attentive, still grounded in the awareness that moments like this did not end when the conversation stopped. They evolved. Adrian finally straightened, the subtle shift in his stance signaling something had settled inside him. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. They will try to reframe this, he said quietly, more as an observation than a concern. Naomi nodded once, her expression calm, unsurprised. They always do, she replied, her tone steady, not cynical, just experienced. Adrian let out a small breath, not heavy, not burdened, but thoughtful. They will say it was strategic, that it was mutual, that it was planned differently than it looked. He continued, his eyes briefly scanning the empty reception desk, the untouched arrangement of flowers that now felt disconnected from the night they were meant to represent. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her gaze following his for a moment before returning forward. That is how narratives survive, she said. They adjust just enough to remain believable. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding that more clearly now than ever before, not as theory, but as something he had just stepped out of. He turned toward her fully, no longer divided between the past moment and the present one. And you, he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. What happens to you after this? Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not surprised by the question, but considering it with the same care she had given everything else that night. I finish my shift, she said simply, and there was no irony in it, no attempt to make the answer larger than it was. Adrian studied her, the simplicity of that response landing deeper than anything complex could have. After everything that just happened, he said, almost to himself. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, her expression steady. The room changes, she replied, but the work does not. The words lingered, quiet but grounded, and Adrian found himself absorbing them in a way he had not expected. He glanced back toward the ballroom doors once more, not with hesitation, but with a recognition of how quickly something significant could become just another version of a story told differently, depending on who was speaking. Then he looked back at her. You could have walked away from it, he said. Naomi met his gaze again, her eyes calm, unwavering. So could you, she answered. The exchange settled between them, not as a challenge, not as a comparison, but as a shared understanding of choice. Adrian gave a small nod, acknowledging it fully this time. Outside, a light breeze brushed against the glass, barely noticeable, but present enough to remind them that the world beyond the building continued without pause. I have spent years building systems that reward control, Adrian said after a moment, his voice reflective, more open than it had been earlier in the night. But tonight showed me how easily control can hide the truth. Naomi listened without interrupting, her attention focused, not performing, just present. Control is easier, she said softly. It does not ask you to question anything. Adrian let that settle, the simplicity of it carrying more weight than most of the complex strategies he had relied on. He looked at her again, not as someone who had intervened in a moment, but as someone who had revealed something he could no longer ignore. And truth does, he said. Naomi nodded once, her expression steady. Every time. The quiet between them felt different now, not filled with tension, not waiting for the next move, but grounded, as if something had been resolved without needing to be declared. Adrian adjusted his jacket slightly, a familiar motion, but this time it did not carry the same need for control, just a habit settling into a new context. Then I suppose tonight was not a loss, he said. Naomi's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to it. It depends on what you thought you were winning, she replied. The answer stayed with him, not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perspective that would not fade as quickly as the night itself. And as the lobby remained still around them, untouched by the noise that would follow, it became clear that what had changed was not just the outcome of an event, but the understanding of what mattered once the performance was gone, leaving behind only the choices that had been made and the truth that had finally been seen. The night did not end with a statement, or an announcement, or anything that could be captured in a headline. It ended the way truth often does, quietly, without asking for attention, Without needing validation, Adrian stood there for a moment longer, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that this pause mattered, that what came next would not be dictated by momentum or expectation, but by choice, real choice, the kind that did not need an audience to exist. Naomi glanced briefly toward the hallway that led back to the service area, then back at him, not impatient, not waiting, simply aware that her part in this moment had already been fulfilled. "You should go," she said softly, her tone calm, not dismissive, just practical, as if returning to something grounded after everything that had just shifted. Adrian looked at her, not surprised by the suggestion, but considering it, weighing what leaving actually meant now. "And you should finish your shift," he replied, a faint trace of understanding in his voice. Naomi gave a small nod, acknowledging the symmetry in it, the simplicity of returning to what still needed to be done. For a brief second, neither of them moved, not because there was anything left unsaid, but because there was something to recognize, something unspoken that did not need to be defined. Adrian adjusted his jacket once more, the motion familiar, but lighter now, no longer tied to maintaining an image, just preparing to step forward. He reached into his pocket, pausing for a fraction of a second before pulling out a small, understated card, not branded loudly, not designed to impress, just a name, a number, a direct line. He held it out to her, not as a gesture of obligation, not as a reward, but as an opening. Naomi looked at it, then at him, her expression steady, searching not for intention, but for clarity. "This is not about tonight," Adrian said quietly, his voice measured, sincere. "It is about what comes after it." Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then took the card, not hesitantly, not eagerly, just deliberately, as if accepting it for what it was, nothing more, nothing less. "We will see," she replied, her tone calm, grounded in the same certainty that had guided her all evening. Adrian gave a small nod, understanding that answer more than any immediate agreement, because it carried honesty rather than expectation. Outside, the city lights continued their steady rhythm, unchanged by what had happened within the walls behind them. But for Adrian, something fundamental had shifted, not in what he could control, but in what he chose to see. He turned toward the exit fully this time, his steps measured, unhurried, each one moving him further away from a version of success that had been defined for him and closer to something he would define for himself. Naomi watched him go for a moment, not with curiosity, not with attachment, but with a quiet acknowledgement of a moment completed. Then she turned back toward the hallway, her path just as clear, just as intentional, leading her back into a space where she would once again be unseen by most, but no longer by herself. The doors closed softly behind Adrian as he stepped into the night, the air cooler, freer, carrying none of the weight of the room he had left behind. And as he walked forward without looking back, it became clear that what had changed was not just the outcome of an evening, but the understanding of what power truly meant, not control, not perception, but the ability to choose truth when it would be easier to ignore it. And somewhere behind him, beyond the polished floors and quiet conversations that would attempt to reshape the story, a woman returned to her work without asking for recognition, without needing acknowledgement, because she had already done something far more lasting. She had reminded someone who had everything that what mattered most could never be owned, only chosen.